Yes, I will try to talk today a little bit about the role of ufology in the history of Russian spirituality during and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I will not go in any detail concerning like any specific cosmologies or specific movements, because while thinking about what would I want to present today, I decided that I would probably like to focus on more of large-scale theoretical questions. So we'll see how I managed to do it. And let me begin by just stating the obvious. The obvious that ufological narratives, although by no means an invention of the 1980s, became particularly visible in Russia during Perestroika and in the 1990s, so much so that it would be, in fact, impossible to create any sufficiently comprehensive picture of Russian spirituality and Russian culture of the period in general, without considering ufology as its important component. But first of all, let's answer a question: what's ufology? MUFON, an American ufological organization, defines it simply as the area of subject matter and activities associated with the interest in unidentified flying objects. Okay, but the next question is, what are unidentified flying objects? And the answer is that, well, we don't know because they are unidentified. That's in the definition. It's important, really, that they are unidentified because personally, I think that the nature of UFOs is such that people speaking about them, in fact, encounter something in the sky. Maybe some rare meteorological or astronomical phenomena, maybe optical illusions. I personally don't care as a researcher. But because these phenomena are unusual and because they fascinate people, sightings of strange things in the sky, whatever they are, become the Rorschach test on which people project their minds and their cultures. It was also pointed out by scholars like Jeff Kripal, who's already mentioned today, that psychological characteristics of UFO encounters that include a presence of something mysterious that is fascinating and frightening at the same time, in essence, is nothing other than the famous Rudolf Otto's definition of the sacred. Whitley Strieber, a famous American contactee, provided the following reflection concerning his experiences. Moses, Paul, and the others who encountered such manifestations in the past saw something, just as people who encounter UFOs, orbs of light, and aliens do today. The only things that are new are the names, and with them a visual grammar that fits our imagination, now directed towards creatures from other planets rather than heaven and hell, unquote. Another North American contactee whose private letter to Whitley Strieber now resides at Rice University's archive wrote, "The experience seemed quite spiritual to me, being it wasn't from this world. I believe I have been transformed. It has altered my state of consciousness. I often wonder about the purpose of my existence. I think about God and the complexities of so many religions on the planet," unquote. So even from these small fragments, these small examples, we see a certain connection between ufology and spirituality that can at times become quite complex. Let us now take a look at how a similar process developed in Russia. I will try to do it by addressing several cases or several stories. The first story is autobiographical. When I was in the third grade, which was in the second half of the 1990s, I studied the traditional Russian wood painting, like Russian dolls, that kind of stuff. Our instructor was what I would call a folk Orthodox Christian. She didn't belong to any specific religious group other than Russian Orthodox Church, but she had a gamut of quite peculiar views about religion. Among these views, the notion of satanic conspiracy had a special place. During our classes, we would often hear about spiritual warfare in which Satanists plot to kill Orthodox priests or seduce Russian youth, driving it away from Orthodox Christianity. UFOs were a part of this conversation because, according to her, they were nothing but demonic apparitions. To prove this point, she authoritatively claimed that UFOs always avoided Orthodox churches, and if they needed to fly near a church, they have to make an arch like so to avoid spiritual energy emitted by the church. Should we encounter UFOs, we were recommended to pray and cross ourselves to fend them away. So I called her views folk Christianity, but in fact the demonological interpretation of UFOs was and still is the mainstream in Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Kirill, for instance, once said that, and I quote, "These are no UFOs. It is the devil who, throughout the history, in various ways appeared to people. He manifested himself as pagan gods. He can manifest himself as space aliens. We should be cautious so that UFOs do not become new paganism, new delusion, through which people unconsciously and unwisely worship dark forces. The same is true about occultism, astrology, magic," unquote. In this case, we see a polemical language utilized by Russian Orthodox Church. This language seeks to establish a dominance of the Church by means of claiming the right to explain the true nature of UFOs, which is identified as religious, classified as a false religion, and labeled as demonic or pagan. This allows Orthodox speakers to monopolize the production of knowledge in this sphere while rejecting alternative interpretations. Furthermore, texts like these appear in Orthodox literature usually under the rubric of fight against superstitions, thus implicitly claiming the authority of science as an ally. To the next story. The second story is from 1995. Some time ago, while doing research for my dissertation, I started watching through the archive of TV shows of this time, including a show called Technodrom имени Kulibina. Technodrom was a show that aired from 1992 to 1996. It was completely unrelated to religion, by the way. It was about computers, technology, and above all about Russian inventors, hence the name. It was pretty mainstream, appeared first on Russian Channel 1, later on RTR, and it was famous for receiving a lot of letters from the audience, which is great for me, because through these letters, we can get a good idea of what people were interested in at the time. One of the episodes that aired in 1995 featured two very peculiar letters. First, Vitaly Savinkov from Novosibirsk sent to the show a detailed blueprint of a flying saucer, assuming it was a spaceship, and explaining how it could, in theory, fly. The host of the show put this letter in a category of somewhat humorous, but at the same time praised the blueprint for original and interesting technical details. Right after that, he read the next letter, and mind you, it's a show absolutely unrelated to the paranormal. But right after that, the next letter. And the next letter asked to find people, like engineers, capable to create a device to hunt evil spirits, similar to one featured in Ghostbusters movies, which were, by the way, quite popular in Russia at the time. To that, the host answered that we already have such a device and that the device is Russian Orthodox Church. Once again, this conversation happened outside of any religious institutions, outside of any religious settings. It was just a show about technology. But what we see here is an implicit negotiation of the borders of science and religion after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The conversation defined it by the need to rethink the line between the two. For Patriarch Kirill, quoted above, a matter of UFOs was a theological problem. But for the host of Technodrom, the question of UFOs remained a matter of engineering speculation. Granted, it was recognized as a fringe subject, but a subject that was evaluated from an engineering standpoint, while evil spirits, on the other hand, were completely surrendered to Russian Orthodox Church as the church's domain. Now, moving to the story number 3. This time we are moving a bit further in time to the mid-2000s. Back then I was acquainted with people involved in Western ritual magic. That, again, an autobiographical story, sort of. And among these people, I knew a person who found an interesting way to advance his magical practices. For that, he joined a rather well-known ufological group called Cosmopoisk that organized expeditions to anomalous locations, presenting themselves as paranormal investigators. However, some members of these expeditions, like a person whom I knew, apparently had a hidden agenda. They secretly performed magical rituals in anomalous locations, relying on their own esoteric interpretations of what was going on. Now, let us take a brief look at Cosmopoisk, because the group itself is rather interesting. It was created in the early 80s, primarily through the efforts of a Moscow engineer Vadim Chernobrov, who was in his 20s at the time. The organization emerged originally as a student club at Moscow Aviation Institute, a place where Chernobrov was a student and where one of the first Soviet ufologists, Alex Zigel, was a professor. Chernobrov's views, and by extension views predominant in Cosmopoisk, favored scientific language. In one of his interviews, Chernobrov said that ufology is, and I quote from him, definitely natural science. And that, and again, quote, mysticism is just the limit of our knowledge. Science is what is real. Ufology, while a signature topic of Cosmopoisk, was not Chernobrov's only interest. In fact, he avoided calling himself a ufologist and favored other terms such as a researcher of anomalous phenomena or his coinage, cryptophysicist. His various interests included time travel, ball lightnings, and psychic abilities. He was even a judge in an early season of the Battle of Psychics, Bitva Extrasense. As far as esotericism is concerned, on Cosmopoisk's bulletin board, there is a dedicated section entitled Religion, Mysticism, Esotericism, although it's relatively small, to be honest. For a long time, a key moderator of this section, who kept it active, was a coordinator of Cosmopoisk, Vladimir Kukelnikov, who died last year. Let us take a turn to the section and try to figure out what understanding of science, religion, and the paranormal is proposed there. There is, for instance, a conversation there that deals with Slavic paganism. Among messages from people recommending literature, mostly books of Boris Rybakov, and among warnings to avoid dubious texts like Slavic Vedas, there is an interesting comment from Kukelnikov. His message is concerned with an issue of ritual sacrifices, like food sacrifices in pagan practice. Another author in the thread expressed a belief widespread in esoteric and pagan circles that gods do not physically consume sacrifices, but that they are concerned primarily with intentions of believers. To that, Kukelnikov replied that he had recently started a poltergeist case in which the poltergeist stole wine and food from people involved. Thus, he concluded it is possible that ancient people mistook such poltergeists for gods and made sacrifices to them. The case solved, the essence of paganism exposed, the scientific explanation for it provided in a form of an extended science stretching beyond the realm of what Cosmopoisk members would call the academic dogma. Pagan and esoteric communities responded to such claims, as well as to their orthodox critics and to the skeptics, by claiming the higher knowledge of their own. While Cosmopoisk members were ready to redefine paganism and Christianity alike in terms of UFOs and poltergeists, their more esoterically inclined counterparts did exactly the opposite. They redefined UFOs and poltergeists in esoteric terms. Examples are plenty. For instance, Vladimir Shemshuk, an author writing in a genre of a mix of alternative history and Slavic paganism, although admittedly rejected by mainland Slavic pagans, in his lectures claimed that planets of the solar system are inhabited by people from Earth. So they aren't really aliens, they are people from Earth, and they speak Russian, by the way, which for Shemshuk is the sacred magical language present throughout the galaxy. While it might seem on the surface somewhat similar to narratives of alternative science, and there are indeed intersections between the two, Shemshuk's claims here are much more overarching. Extraterrestrial civilizations are understood here through Shemshuk's esoteric language, and the cosmology entirely different from the conventional one. So when I say alternative science, what I mean is an idea that in general accepts modern cosmology but rejects just some of its parts, postulating a possibility of things like maybe telepathy, maybe time travel, something like that. But it's not the case with Shemshuk, because he wants to rewrite our understanding of the world completely, and that's what it makes it so different. To illustrate what I mean, here's one example. So for instance, he claims that visions of heaven and hell, particularly visions of hell and the afterlife, reflect experience of human beings whose subtle bodies are caught by the evil extraterrestrials to extract spiritual energy from them. So an entire set of theological, cosmological, anthropological notions derived from Western esotericism, from ufology, were introduced by Shemshuk himself, together with very complex conspiracy theories, coexist in this narrative, creating entirely different model of the universe. In all these examples, the topic of UFOs became a contested ground claimed by multiple groups after perestroika. The debate concerning UFOs was deeply political debate, in a sense that all involved groups wanted first and foremost to establish their authority as the source of true knowledge, while undermining similar claims of their opponents. For instance, Russian Orthodox Church advanced its demonological narrative in which UFOs were perceived as a spiritual threat, together with other forms of paganism, occultism, magic, astrology, and Satanism, which are essentially in Orthodox narratives are all the same things. For scientists and engineers, the stake of this discussion was, first of all, the need to redefine the borders between science and religion within the context of the collapse of the Soviet system and the rise of Russian Orthodox Church, as well as new religious movements and sorts of alternative science that challenged the authority of the mainline science. Different groups within scientific community expressed different approaches to the topic, from radical rejection and criticism to a cautious acceptance of it, at least as a form of an entertaining speculation. Moving forward to the domain of alternative science, we see the claims of knowledge beyond the so-called academic dogma. This position became particularly strong during the 1990s through a combination of two factors: a post-Soviet reverence to science and skepticism about the mainline scientific community that was perceived as a part of now discredited Soviet system that at some points, let's be honest, rejected things like genetics, cybernetics, psychoanalysis, and so on, thus making it inherently untrustworthy, while making arguments like, oh, these people now reject UFOs, but wait, aren't these the same people who recently rejected genetics? More convincing than ever before. Finally, pure esotericism tried to establish its authority by claiming the knowledge of an even higher order that resides beyond both mainline and alternative science. While alternative science often rejects pure esotericism as not scientific enough, esoteric discourse rejects alternative science as too conventional and effectively unable to reach the true spiritual reality. Those of you who attended the New Age workshop last fall probably remember how Vladimir Wiedemann was skeptical about including certain figures affiliated with alternative science in the category of New Age, because for him, these people were not spiritual figures, but mere Soviet engineers, or as he called them, ingenieryo. It, I think, is quite characteristic of this particular position. Now, as to why the conversation about UFOs and related paranormal ideas was so important during and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the answer, I believe, is that this topic is a contested ground, a gray area between science, religion, and esotericism. In periods of social change, not necessarily crisis, mind you, but change, established social order shifts, and the borders between different spheres of society have to be redefined. That particularly affect borderline regions. Nobody, I think, would challenge the fact that Newtonian mechanics belonged to the realm of science, or that the Nicene Creed belongs to the realm of religion. The situation is very different, though, in the borderlands, of which ufology is an example. UFO is unidentified, and therefore it can be interpreted in multiple ways. religious, scientific, and others, thus making it a contested territory. By establishing their authority in this territory, different social groups redefine their relations to each other and secure their positions within the social hierarchy.